Good evening. Today we know that musicians travel all over the world. They fly from one city to the next, and musicians from different countries all know each other, and it's not unusual to be in one country one day for a concert, and another country the next day for a concert, and then cross continents. And we tend not to think that that was always true. Of course, there was no airplane travel, but people in the 18th century, in Schubert's time, and in the early 19th century, musicians especially did know each other from country to country. There was quite a bit of touring and familiarity. So the story of this piano trio actually begins in Italy with the Italian tenor Giuseppe Siboni. Giuseppe Siboni was a famous singer, opera singer, toured, he went to London, he went to Vienna, and when he was in Vienna, he became friends with Franz Schubert. And Franz Schubert wrote the words to An die Musik, the famous song by Franz Schubert. So Schubert and Schubert, both Franzes, were very good friends. And Giuseppe Siboni then married Schubert's sister. So now there was a connection between an Italian opera singer and Viennese family. And then Siboni eventually moved to Denmark, where he started and was the founder of the Royal Danish School of Music, and he was a famous opera singer. While he was there, among his students was another Viennese person, another friend of Schubert, and this was Josephine Fröhlich. Now, Josephine Fröhlich was a soprano, and she had two sisters who were sopranos and a third sister who was an artist. They were very popular in Vienna, and they were part of the musical society, the musical elite, the community that presented concerts in their homes and would have famous composers coming to hear music by other musicians. So she invited a Swedish tenor who was also studying with Siboni to come to Vienna. And the tenor was named Isak Berg. Isak Berg was famous for singing Swedish folk songs. So he came to Vienna at the invitation of Josephine Fröhlich, and in her home sang a concert of Swedish folk songs. In the audience was Franz Schubert. And Franz Schubert became so enamored of these songs, these Swedish folk songs, that he asked for copies of the music right away, and he told everybody how much he loved this music and that he was going to use it to write some new music. And he did use one of the songs, and the song was used in the slow movement of the piano trio in E-flat major that we're going to look at today. The song that he loved is called Se solen sjunker, and it is embodied in this piece in a way that seems to suggest almost haunting the piece. Now, Schubert didn't need to use this song. Something about it spoke to him. And it seems to be, and here I'm indebted to the musicologist Christopher Gibbs, it seems to be that this song reminded him of the Eroica Symphony funeral march. And we'll explore that in this lecture in just a moment. So, this song becomes the slow movement. How does that happen? Well, we'll take a look at that. But why does this matter? Because amazingly, what happened was right after Schubert heard this song, Beethoven died. And Beethoven's death had a profound effect, of course, on the musical community and very specifically on Franz Schubert. Schubert was a torchbearer at Beethoven's funeral. There were probably about 30,000 people at this funeral. And Schubert decided to give a concert, as Beethoven had done, of his own music, as Beethoven had given a hugely successful concert of his own music in Vienna. And he planned this concert in a way that seems to suggest that the concert itself was a tribute to Beethoven, because it was given actually an exact year to the day that Beethoven died, 1 year later, in 1828. Let's hear the song that moved Schubert so much that he incorporated it into this trio. The song Se solen sjunker. I'll tell you what it means. See, the sun is setting behind the high mountain peaks. You take flight before the gloomy shadows of the night, O fair hope. Farewell, farewell, alas, the friend forgets his true sweet bride. Farewell. It's the farewell that becomes the motif for almost the entire work. Let's hear the song sung as Schubert might have heard it.
Sie sollen Schinken
So if you know the Schubert trio, that was probably a little bit alarming. Did Schubert need to plagiarize? I don't think so, because he wrote 600 of his own songs and so much music that nobody, not even Mozart, really did the same, because don't forget, Schubert died before his 32nd birthday. So Mozart, made it to 35. So it's the closest comparison. But there's nobody else in the history of music who wrote so much music that is so great in such a short time. But he loved this folk song, and the song, it seems, reminded him of the funeral march from Beethoven's Eroica. And we'll get to that in a moment. But let's hear what Schubert actually wrote. This is based on the song. This is the opening of the second movement, the way Schubert wrote it. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Now, it's not exactly the same, but it has a few things that are the same. So, excuse me, Michael. The song begins, but it doesn't have this little, but that little device actually is typical of Schubert. He uses it in other songs to have a little accent on the end. In fact, somewhere, in one of his songs, let's see if I can remember this. Yeah, from the opening Gute Nacht from Winterreise. And what we have here, aside from that rhythm, is that this song begins. And this begins. in fact, the opening is completely different. But then we have in the song, which of course you heard, quite a lot of in the trio. And you also hear, which is in the song, which occurs here. So Schubert took what he liked from it, and then the rest of it seems to be shaped on the Eroica slow movement. So he actually was, probably when he heard this song, and I have to say there are a lot of musicologists writing about this, and I mentioned this guy Christopher Gibbs because he's obsessed with this and very interesting, that it seems that when Schubert heard the song, it became connected in his mind with Beethoven's death, and the words too, farewell, farewell, over and over. So let's listen to the opening of the Eroica slow movement, the funeral march, and we're going to go exactly as far as we did with this, because not only does he imitate the shape of it combined with the song, but the first phrase, like you heard the solo piano, the first phrase is the strings dark and low, and then the second phrase where they come in and you get a higher part and it's brighter is similar to what Beethoven does with the oboe in this movement. Okay, now, pardon me. The song also has this phrase, which is just la 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 la. So the words there are not very profound. But Schubert creates this phrase, and I think what got him there is the second phrase of the Eroica. Here's the first phrase, faster, and then. So if you go dee dum ba. So this exact length of time and the way that ends a phrase he uses as the beginning of a phrase. And it really haunts it. It haunts the music. Before this was discovered, and when was this discovered? It's kind of interesting. This song was finally located in 1978. And people had been discussing it in Schubert discussion circles since Schubert's death in 1828. And the reason is there are diaries and letters which refer to the fact that Schubert loved that Swedish song, but they didn't have the name of it. So he loved those Swedish songs. He asked for one of them in particular, and he put it, I think, in the trio. Someone else, I think he put it in a quartet. No, I think it's back and forth. So, of course, the scholars were at it for many, many years. And eventually, in 1972, there was an article saying, we finally realized it's not true. There is no song. And then in 1970, unfortunately, that was published for the person who wrote that. And then in 1978, it turned out to be fake news, which is okay. And then in 1978, somebody found the song, and everything's now changed. I'm still waiting. I bet there's another song that is in a quartet. I'm not going to spend my time looking for it, but be my guest. All right. So the next thing that happens in the Beethoven are some triplets. This is the next section of the Beethoven slow movement of the Eroica. let's just stop it right there. Now let's hear a little bit of what happens in Schubert's piece right after the theme that we just heard, so starting at 41. All right, so of course thank you, it's completely different music, but the piano is playing the triplets with the theme on top of it, and it's very, very similar. Now, if you think we're stretching it here, I've got some wonderful bit of information here. Schubert's original version of this piece was much, much longer. That's always true with Schubert. In fact, the last movement of the piece is now 900 measures shorter, and it's still very long. People used to tell him, your music is too long. How could someone who died at 31 not only write all that music, but it's also long? It's amazing. He didn't cut corners at all. It might have saved him by using the Swedish song and the Eroica, 15 minutes of work, I suppose. So here is something cut out of this exact movement by Schubert. This is something in his manuscript you can see if you look at the manuscript, which is not in the music if you listen to it. Okay, I think he thought better of that quote. See, he was a good editor. I always tell composition students, do not censor any of your ideas. Write them down. Don't ever censor, but then go back and cut out the things that some small voice is telling you maybe not. Schubert obviously did that. This is almost like you're laughing. It's kind of amazing that he put that in there. You know, but Beethoven had just died. And this piece was given its public premiere 1 year to the day after Beethoven's death at a special concert that Schubert organized. Was not supposed to be in honor of Beethoven, but it clearly was to everybody. He didn't originally pick the exact day. He was trying to find something in that week, and just like we all know from real life, he was juggling which performers are available when and rehearsal schedules, and he ended up with the exact day that Beethoven died 1 year later. This is the only concert in Schubert's short life that he ever gave publicly of only his music for his own benefit. One concert. And on that concert, this was the centerpiece, and there was one actual premiere, a first performance. This was the first public performance, but it had been played privately. The only piece that was given a complete brand new premiere was called Auf dem Strom. So we're going to skip to that one. And the reason that we're going to play Auf dem Strom is that there's a quote in it from the same movement of the Eroica. So he obviously was thinking about this now. Remember, the Eroica slow movement begins. Now let's listen to the opening of Auf dem Strom, which is for voice, horn, French horn, and piano. And you have to listen for almost 2 minutes to hear the quote. Now, it's obviously faster, but that phrase in the horn was exactly the same thing. When we have, and then as, it's, it's a reference to it. And what are the words? Again, there's a farewell. In this case, we have the word Abschiedsküsse, farewell kisses. But at that moment that happens, the translation is, the river's current is already sweeping the bark swiftly away, but my tear-clouded gaze turns longingly back again. All of the texts that he set and for this concert, or this one, and also the song, the Swedish song, are tearful farewells, looking back and wishing that it would not be over, that it wouldn't end. So, what happens with this piece is that, of course, it has to be structured into something. It's not just a bunch of quotes and tunes. Although, unlike Haydn, who tended to take one little melody and do everything with it, or Mozart, who let many, many ideas and motifs and tunes just flood through the music, and also developed all of it, Schubert often, even in fast movements, would take a complete tune, a complete song. He did it many, many times. Usually they're his own songs. In this case, it's obviously a combination of a song he heard and Beethoven. But he takes an entire melody and comes up with a developmental structure for it. This is basically a kind of rondo, and a rondo is a very unfortunate word for this, but it basically describes a memorable idea, which is something keeps coming around. So there's an A section, which is the tune, B, which in this case is huge and has 3 intersections, and then A comes back differently, but it's the same melody. B comes back, greatly expanded, and then A comes back again. The A in the middle has a gigantic development section. So it's A as a tune, A returns, highly developed and very dramatic, and A comes back as a coda. In between, we have this triplet music, which becomes very powerful also and becomes expanded, especially the second time it comes back. The most dramatic part of the piece is the A section in the middle, which is like a development section in that things become explored, they become more intense, they become more chromatic. Let's hear that section, if we could, starting right at 84. Okay, and then we come back to the beautiful triplets. That's an extraordinary expansion of it harmonically, and it's referred to as being terrifying. I don't know. It's hard to say. Whenever we give a simple word like terrifying to something, people will disagree. But it certainly is intense. It's a tremendous intensification of that tune. I'm going to take a look at this harmony with you very closely. But first I want to review a concept of symmetry. We've talked about symmetry last week in terms of structural symmetry, a tune and its repeat, the large sense of structure of symmetry. But even one chord can be symmetrical by itself. And that's important because a symmetrical chord, and some of you know the one I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to add a new one. The diminished seventh chord is a symmetrical chord because you cannot tell when you change its position, it remains the same structure. So I always compare it to a really good tennis player. All the intervals are the same. And if you're playing tennis and you're like this, nobody knows where to hit the ball because you could go this way and you could go that way. But if you are ready like this, obviously it should go there. It's similar in music because when you have a harmony, it tends to want to resolve in one direction or another. Usually a chord is like this. I'm leaning to one side for those listening to the podcast. And leaning to the other side if a chord is going to resolve this way. But if a chord is completely symmetrical, you don't know what it's going to do. So a diminished seventh chord, and there is one here, could go many places. In fact, just a little bit earlier, it does do this. But it could, this diminished chord could go many places. Equally valid. It could go to major keys too. This one does this. Not one of the ones I played. The chord progression, though, starts here. It goes to a minor key. Already we're a little surprised. There comes the diminished chord. It goes to a place we don't expect. And this goes to a dominant of a key we are not in, all right? Which goes to a chord that needs to resolve like this, perhaps. But it doesn't. It does this to another chord that happens to be symmetrical. So what makes this powerful and dramatic is that every time the chord changes, we don't know where we are exactly for sure. Each chord is ambiguous. Each chord has potential to go somewhere else. Each chord is in a new key. Imagine yourself driving down a road where you don't know where you are and you don't have GPS. And you just keep making turns, and each place looks worse, not better. Like you think, oh, I know where we are. No, I don't. That's what this is like. You don't know where you are. So this chord that we ended up on for a moment goes back to the chord it came from. Wouldn't you do that if you were totally lost? All right? And then that finally resolves, and we arrive at a key. Now, this symmetrical chord is not diminished. This is a chord that has many names in the world of theory, and composition. None of them are going to be that interesting to you, probably, but unless you're writing music. But one of them is called the French augmented sixth. Okay, you could throw that around if you want. Schubert never heard of a French augmented sixth, so it doesn't matter. Another one is a dominant seventh with a flat five. He never heard of that either, although he would understand what that was. Now, what's symmetrical about it is, let's take the dominant seventh. This is one of the most common chords in music. If you play the guitar, Okay, so if you play the guitar, you can just slide up the fret, right? But what happens here is this note moves. Now, he didn't come from there. It's symmetrical in that we have these are the intervals. Major third and another major third. And in between is a major second, which means, trust me, that I can take the bottom one and put it on the top. I get the same structure. Now you hear why it sounds French, because it's got whole tones in it. It sounds like Debussy. You wouldn't think that was Schubert doing that. In Schubert's day, that chord was a terrifying chord. In other words, it symbolized the unknown and the ambiguous and the mysterious. he uses it quite a lot. In fact, I think I'm going to pause before I go on in this analysis, and let's hear a little bit of his song, The Doppelgänger. Doppelgänger is a scary thing, right? You know, when you run into yourself somewhere, probably unexpectedly. This song he wrote after he wrote the trio. It's one of the group of his swan songs, one of the last songs that he wrote, which is in the set, called the Swan Songs. So here's the middle of it. This is sung by a very powerful, dramatic German tenor. Schock is his name, and it is shocking. So let's hear the middle of Doppelgänger. And the reason I'm playing this for you is all the scariest moments are the same harmonies, that same idea of this chord, instead of a dominant becoming a French sixth, or it's the same chord when he sings Pain, which is Schmerzgewalt, and then it comes back again here. So you'll hear how it's used with the words all are about pain when upon seeing himself in another face in the dark, and with the way the music is structured. The chords are just laid out on the piano, strong, low, nothing else. Let's hear that.
Da steht auch ein Mensch und starrt in die Höhe und ringt die Hände vor Schmerzensgewalt. Mir graust es, wenn ich sein Antlitz sehe. Der Mond zeigt mir meine eigene Gestalt. Doppelgänger.
Yeah, so there are two chords there. They are both augmented sixth chords. There's this one and this one. And this is the one we're talking about. Now, what's interesting in the history of harmony is that a chord like that, which is not scary to us now except in a context, you know, and the context needs to be rather full for us to feel its terror or its pain, those chords get used more and more often. You can find them in Haydn. Then you find them more in obviously Schubert, and even more in Schumann and Brahms. And then by the early 20th century, they get used very differently. For example, here's something where they appear all over the place, that exact chord. It was written in the stars, what was written in the stars shall be. There it is. Okay, that's the chord, the terrifying chord. Now, what Harold Arlen is doing is using these chords for a kind of angst and pain that you don't associate with pop music at that time, except for him, which is very interesting. It's in a minor key, which you don't expect in popular music at that time. And for him, it is what's called a substitution chord. And I'm going to relate that back to Schubert, because Schubert did write 600 songs, and that song you just heard is an example of where that kind of thing will occur to him first. Simple, clear piano writing for a song becomes more intense and more developed and more complex and richer in the chamber music. So if this were just two chords, they would be, there's a note added to the first chord, and instead of this, he raises some of the notes and keeps only one. So he's altering it and substituting a slightly raised version of the chord for that. Schubert did the same thing, but when he raised or lowered it, it was for one note having a very powerful effect on some word in an incredibly emotional way. Here, by the time Harold Arlen did it, there were hundreds and hundreds of pieces of music had been written with these chords. So they don't feel the same. It's like if you ever remember, of course you remember, getting an airmail letter, how special that was. And opening that paper very, very carefully. And taking out the envelope and reading something on super thin paper with the ink bleeding through, as opposed to an email. Email's great, but you give up, right, something for that. There's a speech in Inherit the Wind about what you give up for each invention. You can look it up, it's very good. But it's also like spices in food, and that might even be more to the point. There are spices that are very distinctive and have cuisines built around them, like some of these chords have whole contexts of a composer's style built around them. Like take turmeric, which some people call turmeric, and they're both in the dictionary. So I don't want to hear about that. And please don't write an email to me about that. Okay, so, but turmeric is a very specific spice which has many cuisines developed around it, especially Indian cooking, but others. But now that you find out how good it is for you, people sprinkle it all over the place. And it's lost some of its power. It has not lost that it's good for you, and it has not lost that it tastes good, just like the Harold Arlen. It's still good for you, and it still tastes good. It's just not as specific and as detailed, and the context isn't so rigorous as it was when Schubert did it. Okay, now, I knew I could get through that. Now, I just wanted to say that Schubert had some choices. When he gets back from that chord, he very cleverly begins the tune before the chord resolves. He goes, and the tune begins here. So first he has you not knowing from one chord to the next where you're going to stop, what key you're going to be in, and then it overlaps, so the resolution is hidden under the melody. Then he does the whole thing again transposed. And this is an example of, that people argue about, is he romantic, is he classical? Don't get into that argument, okay? I mean, maybe you haven't been in it, but I get that all the time. So is Schubert romantic, is he classical? This is an example of that balance, which you can find in all great composers, of the romantic impulse and the classical impulse, which is the romantic impulse might be described as you don't know what's happening. It's very ambiguous from one moment to the next. It's very chromatic, and you're lost and emotionally at sea. The classical thing is then repeat the entire thing symmetrically transposed. So he does both. He gives you that kind of unstable, unmanageable, unhinged, is a very popular word now, an unhinged quality, and then he balances the unhinged quality with reason, something we have not seen at all. Okay, so you get here it is again, the same chord progression, that same symmetrical chord that we talked about with Harold Arlen, and this time it should go here. And this is where he does something brilliant again, yet again, because if he just transposed it, he would have gone to B minor now, right? It would have gone, he went to F sharp, he went from C minor to F sharp minor, then the transposition would have brought him to B minor. He goes to B minor for how long? Like a fraction of a second. He falls off B minor. And I'll tell you, this is great, because in the first movement, there's a lot of B minor, even though it's a very strange key for an E-flat major piece. Think of it this way. You live by the water. Well, let's change that. You live in the forest, and you're nowhere near the water. But when you make one turn, there's water there. There's not supposed to be there when you're driving. So what did I do? How did I end up by the water? Well, B minor is like that a little bit in this piece. He's an E-flat major. He finds himself in B minor in the first movement a few times, and he gets away from it and keeps coming back. Then in this movement, in the most dramatic spot in the middle, he goes to B minor and immediately turns the car around. Immediately. Because it's terrifying. You see, he goes to B minor here. when it goes, this is B minor, but this, by B minor I mean we're in the key of B minor, because he could have resolved it to, but instead, he goes to the chord of B minor, but that A natural means you're not in the key, you're just near it. He goes back from B minor, bouncing back up to F sharp minor. And by the way, if you read about this, a lot of people make mistakes about this, so this is a great thing to know at a cocktail party. But anyway, this is probably the most terrifying moment in the piece. And the technique that he came up with to make it so terrifying is one, to go back and forth, which is how you feel when you don't know what to do. Back and forth between these two chords, neither is resolving. It's really, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And then the chord that he keeps repeating is a half diminished chord, which traditionally is a very unstable chord, because it could be a lot of places. It needs to resolve in most music somehow. This chord of Tristan is a half diminished chord also. It's actually, it's just put in a very specific place and used a particular way. So if you want to know half diminished, it's minor third, major third. But you can get it on your phone, believe it or not. So there it is. Now, the other thing that he did, aside from going back and forth, is he created the internal visceral feeling of confusion and fear in the rhythm. By doing that, what I mean is he divided the beat into conflicting patterns, which is exactly how you feel like if you have an arrhythmia or something, or if you can't get your breathing straight. So let's demonstrate this. Let's just hear the piano alone first, right at right there. Okay, now, up to that point, you're not hearing the half diminished chord because it's not in the piano, it's added by one note by these guys. So that's another thing, I'm glad to hear that. Now he's going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like that. Let's hear the strings alone, starting at the, whatever that is, the bar after that. No, start at the same spot, Yeah. Okay, so you hear that they're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and he's going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's hear that together in the same spot, and you'll hear not only the two chords going back and forth with no decision being made, but the rhythm of, the visceral rhythm of the feeling of torment and the inability to make a decision. Okay, now, then they switch and the tune goes into the piano, but the cello, play the cello part. He's doubling the time of the 3s into 6. I mean, sorry, the 6s into 12. Go ahead. See? So the feeling is pretty powerful there. Now let's hear all of that together from the same spot and just stopping right at 122. Okay, good. Now, that's pretty dramatic stuff, and it actually is almost a blueprint, a template for how composers would do that later. Now, he got some of those ideas from Beethoven, but not quite the same way. Beethoven's Ghost Trio has some of that kind of thing. But it's quite extreme. And it's also the repetition of it, which Schubert was never afraid of, the repeating of the thing over and over to drive it home. Now, after that, we have a kind of dissonance that is very narrative derived. Meaning, if you take a composition or theory class, you talk about dissonance usually as how it functions. like you would talk about almost anything. Like, it's like grammar. You have, I'll give you a short example. So let's say you have this chord. This chord is dissonant and has certain possible resolutions that are typical. If it's done this way. This interval normally goes here. So and all these dissonances have names. We can have a dissonance called an upper neighbor, a lower neighbor, a suspension. The note's suspended over. But there are other kinds of dissonance that don't have names. And that's because they only appear in the context of a particular piece in a story that's being told. And this is a great series of that. Can we just, yeah, go ahead, Michael. Can you just play the downbeat and just hold the first eighth note of 122? And Michael, just hold your first 16th note. Okay, so what's happening here, did you like that? Okay, now, sorry. What's happening is we've heard this. And then it goes in the piano. But the strings don't do that. They play this. So the strings, it's like, again, you're terrified, you're trying to make a decision, and you have two possibilities, and they both happen for a moment, which is how the brain feels. They both happen. The B minor chord is in the piano, and the G major chord, which is another possibility, is in the strings. So there's a tremendous conflict. He can't just leave that there. He has to explore it over and over. And it is one of the most dissonant things in Schubert, even though it's very brief. You have this. Piano insists. And then the next thing that happens is, because the strings, having played this G against this F sharp, decide that they need to pull the pianist, their friend, back to the right key. They want to get to C major because we're ending up in C minor. And C major is the path there, and it's the calming key. And it also is the corresponding key at that moment to the Beethoven Heroic Funeral March. So he needs to do that too. So they're having a fight over that. So first you have this dissonance, but then you have this one. He doesn't dwell on it like this. He just goes, and then again, and then you hear both notes passing by. Whew. This is intense stuff. But what I mean, this is actually my favorite part of this entire piece, is this dissonance not having any technical name or analytical purpose except to explain the drama of the piece. It's great. Some people hate things like that. I really like that. Okay. We could come up with a name for it, but it might have to be something like Franz's F sharp. Or, okay, can we then just hear, please, oh yes, from that same spot where we drop out of B minor, where you guys, where you just started here. I don't have, my measure numbers are so tiny. No, let's go back to that, 115, and we'll go through the section I just described until we land in C major, and you can relax for a moment. Now, okay, thank you. It's pretty unbelievable. That is one of the great moments in Schubert. Now, pardon me, I just want to point out that the chord that we heard here, this chord, if you lower the bottom note, you get that dissonance. And if you lower the top note, then you have the next chord. So that whole passage could be looked at as a dissolution of a harmony into another harmony, so it can resolve. And if he had only done that, it would still be good. I almost said enough, which would have been too religious. But he didn't just do that. He overlapped them so that the dissonances created by the concept are right in your face or your ear at the same time. Now, speaking of dissolution, Beethoven had a habit of, especially in slow movements, at the end of movements, the theme would crumble. It would come apart and unravel. A very good example is in the Eroica slow movements. Now, this would be the, you got it? Okay. This is the end of the slow movement, and listen how that theme, dim, dim, ba-da-da-dee-dum, ba-dee-da-da-da-dee-dum, it comes apart. What could be more disturbing than having a melody just disintegrate like that? If rests come in, chords come in, notes missing, the rhythm is off, it's amazing. This is one of the earliest examples, but the most famous, which we're not going to hear right now, but from Opus 130 String Quartet, the Cavatina. If you want to listen to that sometime, because it would take too long. But the Cavatina from Opus 130 is famously the most coming apart of all themes of Beethoven. And he wrote the word in that particular piece, beklemmt, over it. He didn't speak Yiddish. This was German. I could tell people thought it was. And it was not the Freilich sisters, it was the Freilich sisters. Okay, but anyway, in the word beklemmt, really means stifled expression, the inability to articulate, so closed up with anxiety, that so much anguish that you can't speak. And so he writes that music just that way. Now Schubert didn't really do that, but he did make a reference to the concept by the way the theme appears in the coda. It does get reorganized, and it has new harmonies that are tugging at it quite differently. So can we play just from the Un poco più lento at the very end? And it should be a little slower than, they know that, but it's a little slower than the tempo of the piece because it is coming apart similarly. So it ends with farewell. I didn't point out to you how many times you hear da, da as a motif, because it's everywhere in this movement. In the major section, E flat major section, C major section, C minor section, F sharp minor, da, da, meaning farewell, is everywhere. Now, that delayed resolution, pardon me, Michael, that delayed resolution that you just heard, well, the strings, after they just sit there, is also a reference to the Eroica, because before the theme gets dissolved, before this, strings do this. Exactly like that. So he was, again, making a reference to that piece. The Swedish song, probably, at least it's the only song we know for sure that he borrowed from someone else, for sure. But I found in my own archives, where I find all kinds of amazing manuscripts that are not known to musicology, just by looking on my hard drive, I found that Schubert may have actually, even though he died at age 31 and wrote so much music, had some time to watch television. Now, before you hear this passage, I'd like you to hear the opening, the actual opening of the last movement. In fact, we'll do two things before we get to that. The opening of the last movement of this piece, which begins as a piano solo. So before I go on to the discussion of something special he did in the last movement, could you play the version that seems to indicate that he may have watched some television before he died? Now, if you don't know it, I'm so pleased. But it's the theme song from, no, Leave It to Beaver. That's okay, it's just as, they're sort of the same. They're all the same. Yeah, it's Leave It to Beaver, which I don't think was on in the 1820s, as far as I know. Okay, now another very important point, though, is, remember I talked about B minor being very important in the first movement, which we didn't look at, and that he moves towards B minor, but quickly turns away and goes to F sharp minor in the middle of the second movement. In the last movement, he not only brings B minor back in, but he brings it in with the melody from the second movement. Now, before we hear that, this is something he definitely considered as an homage to Beethoven, because Beethoven did this kind of thing a lot, and before him, nobody did. So let's hear, do you know which cue I am on? Okay, this is from the end of the Fifth Symphony, the fourth movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. There's a big dramatic section, and then it comes down to one pitch, one note repeated over and over, and that one note brings us into the scherzo movement, which has already come and gone. It comes back briefly, like a vision from the past, and then it goes back to where it was. So let's hear a little bit of that. he didn't have to do that. Obviously, the movement would have been great without it. But this idea of looking back and having something haunt itself, and that's the quality that these things often have in Beethoven. It also sums up memory. You know, I mean, we have this all the time. You're driving down that road towards B minor, and just before you make the turn, you're thinking about, oh yeah, I remember that piece in C major, or something else occurs to you, and then you suddenly make the turn. With Beethoven, the idea of memory became almost real, palpable, in the way he looks back and lets something inform another movement. So a perfect way to make this trio really an homage of Beethoven, even though it already is with all of the things he's done, is to take that key of B minor and get to it in the last movement, and maybe even have the melody, that Swedish song-derived melody, come back in an unexpected place. So I'm going to ask the trio to play from bar 647, and you'll hear the following things. At first, it's the music of the last movement, chugging along. Then, just like Beethoven, it goes down to one note repeated. But that's kind of a funny reference for the really initiated, which his listeners were. Remember, this was a concert a year after Beethoven's death in honor of Beethoven with invited guests, and there were also paying audience. But his audience knew that that note and that repeated thing probably was a reference to Beethoven, but you don't get the quote yet. The quote comes later. And then the most amazing thing is, and you'll hear this, but after the theme comes back in B minor, the difficult key, it makes its way back to the right key, and it gets transformed into a major ending, a major key. And you could say, and I won't stop you, I'm not saying this, you could say that here he has finally dealt with the hero father Beethoven. Beethoven's dead, it's a year later, he has his own concert, and he's been purged himself of Beethoven because Beethoven permeates this piece. And then at the end, the tune that reminds you so much of Beethoven from the movement that reminds you of Beethoven comes back and is completely purged of sorrow. Unfortunately, he died 8 months later himself. But he really did feel that he had shaken loose from Beethoven's shadow. When Beethoven died, there was a very long speech by Grillparzer, who was the great poet and actor of Vienna. And then when the monument a while later was at the grave was unveiled, Grillparzer made another speech, and in that speech he said, "Who will stand beside Beethoven?" And Schubert was thinking, what about me? I'm sure he was. But he understood the problem. And he was a torchbearer at Beethoven's funeral, at which about 30,000 people showed up. There are other estimates, some smaller, some bigger, but that's the middle. So it might have been much larger than that. Sure, it's much, much, much larger than that. Okay. So now let's hear the way this comes back in this last movement. That's quite an achievement there. Now, before we hear them play the slow movement only straight through, I got some requests by email and other sources to deal with Schubert and falafel. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? You don't know about Schubert and falafel? Okay, no. What's been happening is that I felt that one way to explain the syntax of how a composer works is to show how that composer would order falafel. So I actually got almost a laugh out of you, Michael. That's pretty good. So, we did it with Haydn and Mozart, and in order to get the point, I think I have to repeat perhaps the Mozart one so that we can then get the Schubert. I won't repeat the Haydn right now, just the Mozart and then the Schubert. So the Mozart, remember, has to do with the inner phrases blossoming. Here we go. I'd like the falafel platter, please. I'd like the falafel platter, that's the platter, not the pita, please. I'd like the falafel platter that comes with tahini, and that's the platter, not the pita, please. I'd like the falafel platter that comes with tahini, and that's the platter, not the pita, and it's for here, please. I'd like the falafel platter that comes with tahini, and that's the platter, not the pita, for it's for here. So on a real plate, not in a carton, please. And isn't it gorgeous out today? I'd like the falafel platter that comes with tahini, but could you bring the tahini on the side, and that's the platter, not the pita, and it's for here, so on a real plate, not in a carton, please. And don't you agree, it's a simply gorgeous day. I'm really sorry you're stuck in here making falafel. I'd like the falafel platter, please, that comes with tahini, but could you bring the tahini on the side, and that's the platter, not the pita, but I'd like some pita on the side, and it's for here, so on a real plate. What a pleasure it is to come to your store on such a gorgeous day. I'm sorry, truly sorry, that you are stuck inside making falafel on this glorious day, a glorious, sunny, splendid day to eat falafel. You've made me very happy. Okay, and now Schubert, which is a completely different concept. I'd like the falafel platter, please. Oh, how I love the falafel platter. It brings me joy, even in these sad times. Oh, how I love the falafel platter. But pack this up, for now I hear the chimes that call me back to the mill where I must toil. Oh, 'tis awful until the next deep-fried falafel. My fears overwhelm me. The demons fly above me. I cannot escape till death itself sets me free. But now the panic and the fear give way to gentler thoughts of beer. And soon I dream of chickpea batter and my beloved falafel platter. Oh, how I love, how I adore, how I yearn for the splatter of the oil and the taste of the deep-fried falafel platter. How I love the falafel platter. It brings me joy, even in these sad times. Okay, and now... Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And now the slow movement of the Schubert. guys. Okay.